here we see a representative of food resources, and we have a fisherman that has accessed oceanic resources for some protein, and we have a dairy farmer that is using arable land for probably either dairy or it could be cattle, but it looks to me like those are dairy cows. And then we have an abundance of fruits and vegetables. And so one of the things to think about when we consider food resources is the population growth is putting great pressures on our environment. We have high levels of consumption and industrialization. There's an inequality in wealth and land distribution globally. There are inappropriate government policies, poverty, and inefficient technologies, and these all contribute to environmental declines. So it's not just more people, it's also how the resources are being used. Many of the world's populations live in poor countries that are already strained with issues such as food insecurity, inadequate sanitation, access to clean water and housing issues, and an inability to meet the basic needs of the current population. So clearly, as we go forward, one of the challenges of managing a growing population is just the mere presence of so many people and limited resources. Here are some data looking at world per capita energy consumption. It's broken up by color into nuclear, hydroelectric, natural gas, oil, coal, and biofuels. And this is a prediction of what the future will look like. And one thing to be cautious about here is this is measured data in gigajoules per capita year, and this is a different unit here in MTOE per year. And so it's not clear from this graphic what these different types of units exactly are or how they relate to each other. Again, just looking at relative amounts here was my intended message. So ideally, if you were doing a map layout, you would want to do your research and make sure you define what these units are and what type of energy they represent. And it's best to have, if you're comparing graphs side by side, to have the same units. But so let's not look at the x-axis here so much as the relative amounts of the types of energy. This is showing that forecasting into the future, we're going to be looking at a lot more renewable energy, maybe less reliance on nuclear energy, and then you can see coal, gas, and oil. The relative usages will be pretty solid and pretty strong. But here is what we're looking at in the future is the use of renewable energy is definitely going to increase. Unfortunately, China and India are still building new coal power plants. Some estimates say 4 every week. That's more than 1,000 planned worldwide. And about 3/4 of these, again, are in China and India. And the coal, oil, and gas are what they are utilizing in terms of fossil fuels. Also, there are minerals that are being extracted from their ore by digging. It is a very disruptive, very invasive, and destructive process in order to extract minerals from the earth. Forest resources are exploited for the production of timber, and this can cause havoc for animals that inhabit, other plants as well that inhabit. So to extract this resource, you essentially are stripping the entire ecosystem to get those trees. And also, a lot of fishing practices are taking out great quantities of fish from the oceans. And so you can just imagine what kind of an impact this sort of catch would have on a population of fish. It used to be in the 60s and before that a lot of people thought the earth could be unlimited in all of its resources and that we wouldn't run out of anything. But we now know we need to think about sustainable development. And this means development that makes life better and having a better standard of living and improved quality of life. So sustainable development means making sure the things that we do, the goods that we buy, and the lifestyle that we have will not harm the environment. This seems to be pretty intuitive. Unfortunately, with economy-driven societies, you have people that are making a living out of exploiting resources. And I don't think that that's necessarily a negative thing. It just means that we get removed from the resource itself and the replenishing of it and the reharvesting of it. There's also a tragedy of the commons where, especially with ocean resources, a lot of people are harvesting it and there isn't something like a farmer that's maintaining it and thinking about replenishing that crop for the next year. It's the oceans. And so when I say tragedy of the commons, this is a concept by Jared Diamond, and it has to do with lots of people using a resource, but nobody being really the caretaker of that resource. And collapse is very possible in that kind of a situation. But essentially, what we do today creates our tomorrows. If we look at specific definitions, Brundtland in 1987 said sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this is not a new concept. You can see here that this was in vogue in 1987 and even earlier than that. So we need to look at levels of consumption and waste, think carefully about Earth's resources, realizing we're responsible for our actions and that what we do has an effect on other people and places. We need to consider sustainable development as an environmental pillar. And once we understand that resources are finite, it becomes clear that just mass consumption isn't going to work. And approaching sustainable development should encompass all aspects and take into consideration the fact that everything is connected, not just this year that I mentioned earlier, but across generations and across countries. So, one of the main pushes in this whole industry of sustainable development is a systems approach. And so you're thinking about things as parts of a whole. And the issues that we face are multiple and complex. They're never isolated or in a vacuum. We need a holistic vision, and we need to look at the well-being of man and the entire planet together. And so if we look at these systems, economic, social, and environment, these three pillars are all necessary components of a sustainable development plan. And so economic development relies on the environment and the economy, and social and environmental needs contribute to a sustainable and natural built environment. And then our social environment is relying primarily on our social nurturing community and our economy. Now, all of them are necessary for that main focus of sustainable development. Another way to look at some facts related to economic, social, and environmental. So, economic has to do with things like opportunities for growth, gross domestic product, system stability, green jobs, unemployment, and regulation of overexploitation and harmful externalities. We're not going to touch too much more on economy. It's a little bit outside of the scope of this class. I just want you to appreciate it as one of these three pillars. Same with social. I want you to be aware of it, and that if you are going to explore a future in sustainable development, I do hope that you give give a lot of respect to the idea that participation and inclusion of everyone is important, that eradicating poverty isn't just someone else's problem, that the entire world needs to or they need to address this problem. It affects us all. Food security, equitable distribution of resources, better life chances and opportunities, and protection from exploitation. So I will tell you, in my career, I have spent a lot of time working in developing nations. I've worked in Mexico, Jamaica, and various countries in Africa. And so I've come to appreciate that the United States is definitely not sustainable. Now, this is a big, broad, sweeping comment, and I realize it might be controversial, but there is a problem with an open market economy and the whole idea that you can make a profit off of practices that aren't necessarily sustainable. And so finally, the environmental aspect, we'll look more at that in this course. So looking at ecosystems in the biosphere, focusing on air quality, land and water, better management of waste and pollution, respect and protection for all species, the flora, the fauna, and measures to ensure resource sustainability and harmony. So there's a lot of conflicting views and what is sustainable development and how it should be managed and how we should proceed with it. Again, this holistic approach means that we need to sustain people and cultures, natural resources, biodiversity, environment, and ecosystems. All of those things need to be considered, and we need to develop qualities of life for everyone, justice and social equality, institutions, culture of sustainability. Now, you might be saying that is a lot. That's huge, right? That's everything. I just want you to understand that as map makers, you are contributing to this process. Okay. So the term nexus in Latin is the act of tying together or something that binds. And like we see in this graphic, we are all linked and connected to each other. So the United Nations coined this term during the 1980s, and their projects focused on the emphasis on interrelatedness and interdependency, and that related to environmental resources and the transition and flux across spatial scales and between compartments. So I want you to think about spatial scales when you're making your maps and studying what we'll study in this class. So instead of just looking at individual components, the functioning, productivity, and management of a complex system is taken into consideration. Now, for simplicity, to understand the complex part of a system, you often will be looking at one variable, maybe two, maybe a few, like we looked at that Köppen climate classification system and population, but map making, you're creating tools that are parts of a puzzle. And so that water, energy, and food triad that we see here, and the arrows of the reliance between these systems is just driving home the importance that water is needed to generate energy, for instance. And if we look the other way, energy is needed to supply water. We need water to grow food, and food transports virtual water into our bodies. Food can be used to produce energy, and energy is needed to produce food. So another symbol showing you arrows and a circular process. And so the energy and food security nexus along with water means that these three sectors, water security, energy security, and food security, are inextricably linked. So while we may create maps that are showing parts of it, the actions in one area have impacts in one or both of the other areas. We're going to look at each of these three, and I am copying passages from the Millennial Development Goals specifically for you to get the full impact. And so water security is defined as access to safe drinking water and sanitation, both of which have recently become a human right. So these are things that we know are necessary for life. While not part of most water security definitions yet, availability of and access to water for other human and ecosystem uses is also very important from a nexus perspective. If we then move on to the part of the triad of energy security, they define it as access to clean, reliable, and affordable energy services for cooking and heating, lighting, communication, and productive uses. Now, it's interesting to pause here and think that the United Nations isn't including transportation. And that's one of the main things that Americans think about because we live so far above just sustaining and surviving. Most of us, not all of us. I know there are segments of our society that do not, but we are very imbalanced if you compare to the rest of the world in how we live our lives and the things that we think of in terms of security. So for most of the world, it's going back to basics of clean, reliable, and affordable energy just for cooking and heating to make sure you are warm and fed. So uninterrupted physical availability of energy comes at a price, and it can take a great toll on the environment. And then finally, the third part is food security. The Food and Agricultural Organization defines it as availability and access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet the dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. This has also been defined as a human right. If you're interested in this type of mapping, there's some really interesting maps that not only look at food security globally, but in the United States, there's a phenomenon that links poverty to what are called food deserts. And so if you don't have access to good transportation in many urban areas of the United States, you don't have access to nutritious foods. And so that's something you might want to explore or think about. So this is something that's mentioned in your reading, and there was a case study in Kathmandu looking at growing water demand for agriculture, energy, industry, and human and livestock. There's an uneven endowment of water resources, and almost 90% of the water is consumed by the agriculture sector. And about 20% of their population lacks access to safe drinking water. If I ask any class that I've ever taught in the United States, where do you get your water? I've not had anybody say that they had to go a long distance to get their water. Most of us will say from the grocery store or from the tap, and that's not true in all of the world. There's also groundwater depletion. So these agricultural practices are depleting the groundwater, which, as we remember from an earlier graphic, is a significant part of water in a system, and it is being depleted up to 70 to 80% in Kathmandu. And then water pollution. There's arsenic, waterborne diseases, and these all create high child mortality, poor human health, and salination of the water. Here's an example of a map that is showing disproportionate access to safe water. And if we look at the areas of the world that lack access to safe water, let's start down here. We can look at the colors are representing the share of the total population without an improved water source. So the darker areas that you see in this cartogram, this is not the true shape of the continents as we know, but it is shaped according to this data set. So we have areas such as Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and various countries in Africa that are showing up to 50% or more of the population do not have clean water. There are countries that are lower with that figure, and so Mexico, Brazil, India, and China are showing up in the gray range. Less than 30% have inadequate access to safe water. So this is an interesting type of way to display data, and it's again emphasizing the data. We've already looked at a three-dimensional example. Now we're looking at a size example that's two-dimensional, but the distortions really do send a message to you. This is an example of a project called the Aloha Challenge, and so if you want to research on your own, I've provided the link, and this is looking at how they are handling natural resource management using maps and other types of online resources. I encourage you to explore this. One of the areas of this challenge is natural resource management, and let's go ahead and let's take a look at if it'll take me to my external site. If we go to the internet and we actually look at this project, it is constructed like a story map, and you can scroll down and get infographics like this one. And so here's some statistics for you, and looking at the first one, the million gallons per day of water, and then in the goal to increase freshwater capacity, watershed forest areas, looking at how much area is protected in marine managed areas, trying to get a handle on invasive species control and managing the native species. And so these boxes that you see here, if you scroll down, you will have different areas of the website that you can then explore and open up. And there are lots of maps in this website, and this one happens to be a graph and then some information. We're not going to read that here in lecture. I just want you to know that it is there, and I encourage you to explore something like that, especially when you think about developing your class project, which we'll talk more about later. So we know food security, we've looked at the definition, and it has to do with access to healthy and nutritious food. It needs to be doubled in the next 25 years. Per capita agricultural land has been declining. Rice and wheat are high water crops, and they are in great demand in the world for sources of carbohydrates. Increased production needs to come from limited or shrinking areas of cultivatable land. There's an intensification of agriculture that has led to a great dependence on water and energy, and competition for land to grow food and bioenergy for crops and ecosystem services is increasing. These subsectors that you see on this map of crops, livestock, forestry, aquaculture, and fisheries were put into a study and looked at the data sets as it relates to high biomass, which is abundance of land, and then labor and capital. And the colors that you see represented on this map are a combination of these different factors in what is being defined as an agri-food system. If you're interested in reading this article, I'm going to give you, here's the link down here. It is in the PowerPoint slides. And so this map is showing you a modeling of a system based on 3 primary data sets from these subsectors of our food production worldwide. So it's a pretty interesting map to contemplate. Again, if we look at big picture messages, we can see areas of yellow and red are going to be characterized by high capital. Okay. Areas in the blues would be characterized by high labor, and then the green areas are high biomass. And there's a blending or a continuum based on a color wheel of that data. So very, very complex and rich data set, which is summarized in a really condensed cartographic project for you. So looking at energy security, there's a widening demand and supply gap. So the demand is greater than the supply in some areas. 63% of the world has no electricity, and 65% of the world use biomass for cooking. There's a shortage of energy, and this definitely impedes economic growth. In order to meet growing energy demand for agriculture, water, industry, and other economic activities, things need to change. We need to move away from the dependence on traditional sources such as fossil fuels and imported energy and rely instead upon local renewable energy. Here's another map that I want to show you. There is a geosciences collection of interactive maps. There is a link on our Canvas site, and I want to show you this one in particular. And let's see if it'll take me to an external site here. And this is from the American Geosciences Organization. And if we go in, I'm going to go right in here and click to access the interactive map. So we're looking at Minnesota and looking at the land to determine, is it a good place for solar energy? So this app or map app will let you search by address, or you can just browse through and look at the entire state of Minnesota. And so the colors are representing kilowatts per hour per square meter. So that is a measurement of insolation, which is energy coming from the sun. And that's generally what in the general population we think of as solar energy. And this is showing you areas of the state that have different levels of energy in these colors, with the darker blues being lower relative amounts, and then the oranges and the yellows being the highest amounts of energy. I'm going to close that information box, and I'm not going to search by an address, because what I want to show you is that you can search through all of this information. Here's our legend. This icon that looks like 3 pieces of paper, and I want to go in and show you that the map layers, you can look at aerial imagery, or you could look at a street map. You can change that base map if you want. I'm going to go to aerial imagery, and right now my solar visualization is off, and so this would be what Minnesota looks like from satellite imageries, and I'm going to focus in here on this water source that I'm seeing, and I'm going to go back to my legend, and I'm going to turn on my solar visualization, and I just want to see what this area would look like around this water source in terms of suitability for putting in solar energy panels. And so if I were living in an area that were bright yellow and maybe orange, I might think about investing in solar energy for my home. But if I had an area that was characterized by more shade, which you can see in these dark areas, I would not. And the last example that I want to show you for this part of lecture is a geothermal interactive map from the state of West Virginia, and I've already opened that up for us, and you can see that if you've used previous versions of ArcGIS, some of the buttons might look familiar to you, and you can interact and look at these different data sets. And so I just want to show you the temperature and depth data, and so it's going to retrieve that map and load the data, and you can use all of your tools over here to zoom in and out of the data, and we're looking at depths at specific temperatures and temperatures at specific depths, and so you can explore that data set. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, and I'll just turn on 2 more examples for us to look at. If we consider the geological map, this is showing you primary soil and rock types around the state of West Virginia, and then the purple lines are representing fault lines. And then if I turn that off, one last one, if we wanted to look at earthquake activity, we can open up the data layer, and we see that there are earthquake epicenters and historic earthquakes. If we zoom in, we can then see that some of this data is available to us at a zoomed in level. And that concludes what I wanted to show you for this lecture. Thank you for your attention, and come back for the next one soon.